Hi everyone. After watching this latest episode of Severance, Trojan's Horse, I decided to do an immediate review with some comments and theories. Since the episode was relatively chronological, my review will go in the order of the show. So, let's go. Okay, O&D in the export hall. The episode opens with a whistling man with a metal cart going to O&D to pick up items to be sent to the quote-unquote export hall, which we know is the hall where Mrs. Casey and Gemma went when she was being permanently decommissioned. As we remember, Felicia said that O&D used to make trips there themselves until a man, here we see him, was sent to fetch for their items. Here, the man picks up what looks like our dental tools from the O&D team members, which includes Felicia and an unnamed younger woman. We never see the face of the man, but I wouldn't be surprised if he becomes important in future episodes where MDR makes a successful effort in trying to get to the export hall. So the next scene we get is Mark getting ready for work. He is on the phone with his sister. We learned that, to my surprise, the Audis actually allowed their innies to spend an entire weekend with Lumen to experience Ortbo. I just find that extremely ridiculous and so dangerous. So many things can happen, and if you're not cognizant of essentially what an innie is doing with your body, a lot of things can happen. And in this case, something did happen. Lumen excuses Mark's wetness by telling a story that he fell from a rope. Again, this is not something I'd be down for. The first time something weird is happening to my body by virtue of going to work where I'm severed, I'm out of there. Anyway, we see Mark taking pills and drinking like a sea moss-like liquid, which we can infer is supposed to help with his integration. We learn that Regebi is living with Mark for fear that Mark is being watched, so if she wants to be able to communicate and talk with Mark, it's just a lot easier if she's actually living with him to observe his symptoms. More details about the integration procedure shared, including vital information that the process is slow and does not happen immediately. So this answers some questions that I had, at least in episode 4, where it didn't seem like Mark was integrated at all, but we learned that it is a slow going process. It is gradual. It's not just you're integrated and suddenly you have the flood of all the memories, which kind of makes sense cognitively. That would be overwhelming. Anyway, Audi Mark knows nothing about his innie's life, and we see the same as for his innie. Okay, Helena is forced to send Helly down. Helena has a meeting with Mr. Drummond and Natalie about the events of the weekend. Mr. Drummond and Natalie have decided that Helena's father, James Egan, does not need to be made aware of the Ortbo events. It's clear that Helena does not have a direct line of communication with her father. He seems like an asshole, so that might be for her safety, but again, just showing how distant they really are. It's important to note that the medical team uses tempers to refer to Helena's recovery from the events of the weekend. It appears that Lumen is engaging in a sort of pseudoscience version of mental health. Time will tell if there's any truth to the powers of the tempers, but I have seen a reviewer compare Lumen to Scientology, and this is very clear connection. For those who don't know, Scientology also kind of engages in this sort of pseudoscience about mental health. Scientologists are not encouraged to go to therapists and anything, and of course that could be seen as just something to make sure that they never realize they're in a cult, but it's also part of this idea that a lot of the strife that we feel as human beings can be fixed by the Scientology version of what mental health is. Anyway, they mention of an obligement session, so I'm looking forward to see if that's anything like the break room or if it's more like a wellness session for Audis. We see that Mr. Drummond and Natalie make clear that Helena's innie is going to go back despite Helena's protests that the innies are quote-unquote animals that tried to kill her. Mr. Drummond makes clear that James Egan encouraged the return of Heliar despite knowing that Heliar tried to kill Helena. We get a repeat of the mysterious and important work, as well as the high value. We learn more or see that they are really down for this Cold Harbor file to get finished. This scene, while short, illustrates how little agency Helena has in her life. This is no excuse for her sexual perversion. She's a sex pest, as I mentioned previously, but it does give context as to why she felt so compelled to engage in relations with Mark. It was probably her only adult experience of freedom. Alright, so Helly returns to the severed floor to meet for the first time Miss Huang. Miss Huang sits in front of the Keir Barton's His Betrayers painting. As I mentioned, there is some connection to this type of punishment and the punishment that a lot of slaves, black people, during the American slavery went through. I just want to shout out Britt Lower's acting in this entire scene. There's a specific way that Helly hunches that is so cool to see in contrast to the stance of Helena. Also, shout out to the camera work. The camera was really shaky when Helena comes down, and we see that same camera movement at the end of the episode as well. At first, I thought it was about integration, but for Helly, I think it's meant to just express her destabilization in the Lumen environment. Anyway, Mark and Dylan are reunited with Helly and whisked to Milchek's office. The MDR team is immediately confrontational. Helly learns that her outie was in her body for a period of time, and Dylan is insistent on knowing what happens to Irving. I will say, I do love a good, assertive answer my question, which is what Dylan says to Milchek, and Milchek says, "Excuse me." So there's just a funny dynamic there. Anyway, Milchek explains that Irving's permanently dismissed, and Dylan describes it as death. Dylan makes clear that he does not care about Irving's outie. And I think this is important because, again, it's emphasizing that these innies' lives are only when they are working at Lumen, and once they don't work at Lumen, they don't exist. And I think it's important here to distinguish between the lives of the innies and outies, and how the innies can't really appreciate the lives of the outies because they don't get to experience that, and they don't get to know anything about Irving's outie, so why should they care that he is quote-unquote alive and well? And we also know that Milchek is lying. He's not going on a cruise. It seems like, and we'll learn this later, Irving has dinner plans. Anyway, Helly, on the other hand, is freaking out about Helena. Helly is freaking out about Helena body snatching her. She doesn't even know that Helena did the deed with Mark. Anyway, Milchek tells this very funny story of the Grafspen. I am not pronouncing that right. Anyway, the Grafspen story is a Swedish king who dressed as a commoner to know the true grievances of his subjects. I found it hilarious that everyone manages to pronounce this word perfectly throughout the episode. Listen, don't hit me with those Nordic words. I don't get it, but yeah, everyone pronounced it perfectly, and I thought that was a very funny comedic point. Back in the MDR office, we see the quartet desk is now a triplet. Irving's existence is erased from the group and the group photo. Dylan insists on a funeral. Helly backs him up, but Mark is hesitant, only supporting the funeral as long as it's quick. So we see Mark is kind of getting disillusioned with the MDR team writ large. And of course, he's kind of traumatized. Like, I think it's important to point out that he's traumatized by everything. Anyway, we see that Mark is getting sick, probably due to integration, and he heads to the restroom. This is reminiscent of a scene from season 1 where Mark barges in on Helly after she spends too much time in the bathroom trying to write a message to her outie. Anyway, Helly asks for confirmation that Mark couldn't tell the difference between her and Helena, and he's just extremely rude throughout this whole entire encounter. Mark refuses to answer Helly questions about what happened during his overtime contingency. So this is also a reminder that Helly doesn't have any idea of what happened during the overtime contingency for all the members. So she's very, very lost. She's very behind. And I wonder if she'll ever be caught up. Anyway, we see Milchek and Miss Huang prepare for the bereavement. Miss Huang mentions that typically bereavement events only happens for any who die on the floor. And this shocked me. I said, people be dying on the severance floor? They're giving these people like very hard labor jobs where they die on the floor. But then I remember, there are logical reasons why innies would literally die, like physically die on the floor. You hear about people getting heart attacks or just having some mental emergency while at work. So it makes sense that even though work like refining, somebody could still die. So we see the mammalians, nurturable. We see the O&D team. You would think, okay, these are not necessarily jobs that one would die at. But again, there are circumstances where, you just have a medical emergency and you die at work, and that happens. But that's really sad to think that. And then I have so many questions. Like, if you're in a medical emergency while you're severed and you're on the severed floor and they take you back up to the real world, I guess because of the physical separation, you'd be your outie self. But this is so confusing. Anyway, let's proceed. Miss Huang does not approve of Miss Milchek's lenient methodology and believes that he inappropriately humanizes the innie. So this idea of giving a bereavement for Irving, despite the fact that he's technically still alive, but not alive as his innie self, is seen as a weakness. And I think that's important to note, and that Miss Huang has that observation. Again, my theory is Miss Huang is actually an adult in a child's body. I don't know, but that's my thought process. We also learned that they have an affections index for innies, and I just would like to see the affection index for all the innies. Mark's is definitely in the 30s, Dylan's probably in the 20s, and I think Helly's getting there around the 70s. Anyway, Irving's very sad bereavement. A cartoon of Irving is played on a small monitor. A cheaply printed banner provides the quarters of Irving B's existence. We see that he worked for 12 quarters, so his innie was alive for 3 years. So Irving worked for Lumen for 3 years, and we know that Mark has worked for Lumen for 2 years. Anyway, the more puzzling revelation for me was that they are in quarter 882, which would mean Lumen has been in operation for 220 and a half years. If the world of Lumen is in our years, then technically Lumen would have been in operation since 1805, but that doesn't make sense because we learned from the Macrodat Uprising video that Lumen has been in operation since 1870. So even if we're saying that Lumen is happening in the year 2020 or 2015, that still wouldn't add up. Maybe they are counting the years since Kier was born, but that doesn't even add up since Kier would have been 65 when he started Lumen if he was born in 1805 and then Lumen was founded in 1870. And maybe this is a part of this idea of what propaganda does. Maybe Kier was a super old dude when he started Lumen, but from all the context that we get, he was relatively young adult when he started Lumen. We will never know. I don't know what this means, but I think it's important to keep an eye on this. Maybe there is a predecessor to Lumen. Maybe before Lumen there was something else, and maybe even something before Kier. We don't know, but that would be interesting to know what the 220 and a half years actually represent, since I don't think it clearly is attached to the years Lumen has been in operations. Anyway, let's get into it. Dylan gives a Dylan-esque eulogy. My favorite line is, "Suck my own fuck." I just love Dylan and everything he does. Anyway, Miss Huang wheels out an Irving watermelon head, which is creepy as hell. And then we see that Milchek prevents her from playing her theremin, which she did get to play in episode 4. But he says, "Not this time, sweetie." But I think this is also his sort of reaction to her comments about the humanization of the innies. He's saying, well, isn't playing a theremin a further humanization of them? We're not going to give them that. Instead, we're going to have them play some Caribbean song about a coconut. Shout out to my Bahamians, my Jamaicans. That sounds like the vibe that it was giving me there. Anyway, Mark tries to leave early and Dylan and Helly take issue with his rude behavior. Dylan spills about Miss Casey being Mark's outie's wife. And then we see a confrontation with Helly and Mark. Helly confronts Mark in the hallway, but it is clear that Mark has given up. He believes that Lumen knows everything and was playing along with all their independent adventures to learn more about Lumen. So Mark kind of forces us to go into his head, really, right? So on top of learning that he was basically kikiing with Helena, not Helly, he's also realizing that if Helena was the one who was with him this entire time, he's actually made no progress in finding Miss Casey, and that basically Lumen knows about all of their shenanigans. So that is something that I know could be really discouraging. Anyway, Helly fights for her agency and can only assure Mark that he has to trust her, and it's clear that he doesn't. I actually think that he's very well aware that it's Helly. He just kind of is emotionally traumatized, and I don't think he's willing to talk to Helly about that emotional traumatization through what one may call a sexual assault from Helena. Anyway, from her perspective, Helly just calls Mark an asshole. Back in the bereavement room, Dylan remembers that Irving's last word to him were "hang in there," and it's a print poster on the wall. Behind that print, Dylan finds Irving's instructions for getting to the export hall, which we know that Felicia from O&D gave to Irving. Dylan puts a scrap of paper back behind the poster, and I'm looking forward to when he reaches back in there so that we can find out more about that export hall. All right, Milchek's performance review. Natalie escorts Milchek to his performance review. Before heading into the review, Milchek tries to get Natalie to reveal her true feelings about the Black Kier paintings. Her eyes seem to well with tears and sympathy, but she doesn't acknowledge the question and rushes Milchek into the review room. Okay, so personal insertion. As a Black person who has worked in corporate, Okay, even today, these types of conversations, especially in the workplace, can be very touchy. I have worked with other Black people, and these types of conversations, we explicitly have them outside of the office because they can get really touchy. Anyway, what a lot of non-Black people don't realize is how diverse Black people are in their approach to these types of situations. And while I think Milchek is on the right track in assessing that Natalie does not receive the Black here well, it doesn't change the fact that she could not have received the question well. And so, as a Black person, I never go into non-Black spaces, which is actually all of my employment opportunities to this date, and assume that another Black person in the room is automatically my friend or my peer. A lot of Black people in these spaces will go along with anything as long as the check clears in their career progresses. So it can be very dangerous to reveal that, hey, I think that this might be a little racist, or I feel like this is insensitive and I want to say something. This is a Black person that can then communicate to white people or to non-Black people writ large that she's a problematic Black person who's going to complain about the way that Black people are treated. I've even been in situations where a corporation can retaliate and just be like, we're not Black History Month, let's not do that. And of course, we're now in an era where I'm sure plenty of offices are just going to kill all resources for any of types of affinity groups or what have you. But I just want to point that out because I think that this visualization of this moment to a lot of non-Black people is the first time they ever like, oh my God, like, oh, this is what Black people do when we're not around. And it's like, yes, this is what happens. But there's also a lot of tensions there. There's a lot of conflict that can happen. So if you are taking this as a given that like all Black people in the office are going to have the same opinion about like Black events in the corporate world, you're going to be in for a surprise if you actually get the truth of the matter. Or if you bring an opinion from one Black person to another Black person and are surprised that that other Black person does not agree. Anyway, I just want to point that out because I've also been in a situation where a white person gave me an opinion of another Black person they knew, and I was like, how's that relevant to me in my opinion? Nothing at all. Anyway, I'm glad that it seems like Natalie is receptive to Milchek's complaints, but she's got to get her check. She's got to make sure it clears. She's probably making very good money. She seems extremely high profile within the corporation. She's not going to ruin that simply because she wants to commiserate with Milchek. Anyway, in the review, we see that Mr. Drummond kind of blames Milchek for everything bad that has happened. I thought it was funny when they said the review could take 2 to 6 hours, depending on the intonements and approbations that are told or given out. What I find interesting is that they do this monthly, and I feel like this is kind of a version of a break room, right? Like this is kind of torturous. She says, let's start with praise, but the praise was like all of 2 seconds in comparison to his little rant about the Ortbo experience. And Milchek has to do this on a monthly basis. That must feel like torture. And I know that Milchek is kind of doing a bad job, but in general, a lot's happened. Anyway, there are 3 contentions that have been reported. One is that Milchek uses 2 big words. And I will also point out, this could potentially be a microaggression, right? Like a Black person who's not supposed to be as smart as they're actually portraying themselves to be, potentially could be an underlying theme there. But that was a wild thing because I felt like Mr. Milchek spoke like everyone else. But I did kind of think when you compare him to Harmony Cobell, maybe he's not using the same language, but who knows? Regardless, 2, his paperclip was installed improperly. Fascinating. Actually, as a lawyer, okay, this is something that's crazy. If you ever file things with the court or whatever, how you staple things does matter. It does matter. And a judge will get pissed if you don't agree with the way that they tell you to staple things. So even though that seems really petty and little, unfortunately, I've been in situations where you could work so much on the substance of what you're doing, and then it is about the everything else, like stapling something that is going to get you a conversation with your boss. Anyway, and then finally, Mr. Drummond talks about the kindness reforms and how they shouldn't deter, how they are not deterring the curiosity in Ortbo. He also talks about the replacement MDR team that didn't coalesce with Mark. So he's just getting probably reamed in this whole entire performance review, and I wanted to know whether or not this was normal or not normal, but it definitely is to indicate to us that Milchek is on the rocks, and I think he has a lot of pressure on him to make sure that Cold Harbor is completed. And Mr. Drummond reiterates that Cold Harbor is one of the greatest moments in the history of this planet. What a big what a big determination. I do wonder what Cold Harbor is all about, since it seems to me like it's just about making back Miss Casey. Anyway, it's going to be interesting to see if Mark's integration is going to affect that in any way, shape, or form, right? Like, what if, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if Cold Harbor actually ever gets completed, since we know that Mark is 85% done. Anyway, with that being said, let's go back to Mr. Marco. Okay, Mark is leaving work 6 minutes early, which is kind of wild. I don't know why. But Mark is in the elevator, and they have this contentious conversation that ends with Milchek asking whether Mark has informed Helly that he fucked Helena. He said that very clear. So we get a hint that in the episodes moving forward, Milchek is definitely going to put that hammer down. He is not going to be kind anymore. And he's not going to do that whole thing that Harmony Cobell did, which is, or she communicated, which is the way to make people pay or do what you want them to do is to make them feel free. That clearly is not working. So let's go into Rickon and Devin Hale, which is where we get the title of this episode, The Trojan's Horse. Basically, Rickon is editing his book to conform to what Natalie says is appropriate for the innies. Devin confronts him and says, this book, this is completely against everything that you stood for, and you're basically standing up for the propaganda of Lumen. But Rickon says that this book is a Trojan horse. And I wonder if that will be true. I wonder how else the innies will find a way to use this book for their own ends. But in the excerpt that we hear Rickon say, he says something about how the clock moving slowly, which everyone hates when they're in the office, but the clock moving slowly is actually indication of time moving, like time that you actually own. So it's clearly propaganda, and it'll be interesting to see how this works. But they have a couple spat because, of course, Rickon does point out that there are fiscal opportunities available here. While they do seem quite affluent already, you can imagine that they have a newborn baby. It is very stressful. So yeah, Rickon's like, do you want me to make money or not? Also, is it clear what Devin does? I don't know if Devin works or not, but yeah, I could see her feeling the pressure as well, fiscally speaking, to have Rickon write this book. But I could see the danger because she does have affection for any Mark, whom I'm assuming she's going to see again, and the turmoil that he's going through. So next we get to our faves, Irving and Bert. We see Audi Irving discard his export hall paintings and then go down to a payphone to call a mysterious person, which a lot of people assume are Regebi, but I don't know. Maybe it's not. Anyway, he's calling this mysterious person, and he says he was fired and thinks Lumen knows what his innie is up to. So that's not true. He just tried to kill he just tried to kill one of his coworkers. But anyway, Bert is again watching Irving and explains when Irving confronts Bert that he just wants to know why Irving was at his house the other night, banging on the door. We learned that Lumen's explanation for Bert's firing was that his innie had an unsanctioned erotic entanglement with another worker. He suspects it's Irving, and that Bert's husband Field thinks there's legitimacy to that affair. So yeah, essentially Irving is messing up Bert's situation. In order to assuage Fields, Bert invites Irving for dinner. So exciting to see. I'm excited to see that dinner again. These are it. I remember this, but I was just because it's Black History Month, Black films are brought up again, and Do the Right Thing is one of the most important Black films of the past century, and films, whatever, is one of the most important Black films. And I totally forgot John Turturro's in that. He's so good in that show. If you have never watched that film, please watch it. It's so good. And of course we have Christopher Walken, so it's exciting to see them together. So now we get to Mark's integration. Back at Mark's home, Regebi is going through Gemma's stuff to find memory points to text Mark when he's fully integrated. Regebi says that Lumen knows people at the morgue, which is likely how they acquired Gemma's body. Regebi says one more day until full integration. However, Mark starts hearing Miss Casey's voice and what she say during wellness session. So his memories are of Miss Casey, not of Gemma version. Anyway, Mark is transported to the break room hallway, and then he opens the door and it goes into the white Lumen hallway where he sees Miss Casey's face, and the episode ends there. So I'm assuming the next episode we're going to see an integrated Mark. This is really exciting. I unfortunately won't have an immediate reaction for the next episode because I will be watching Monkey by Osgood Perkins, but I'm hoping to get something out by that Friday. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. This has been a great time, and I'll see you next time. Bye.